they say they but be alright on time. They say it's up to 4:30.
Is that okay? Speakers here.
I just the one at the front, the one at the front. Yeah, a little bit.
And we do believe that the Lord is with us.
Oh, right there. Right, perfect.
So at this time, I'm going to invite the Reverend
Good?
Paul to
Okay.
lead us in the opening prayer.
Okay. So give me 1 second when you come to.
Invite us
Okay.
to bow for this time. Gracious Lord of this universe, we acknowledge that you are sovereign, that you created us in your own image, and you have liberated us from into a marvelous life because of your wonderful grace. We come to you this evening in this lecture. We thank you for the one into whose honor we are gathered this evening. We thank you for the spirit of liberation, making you known to your people in this nation. We know that it is through your power, through your spirit, that we have divine revelation, inspiration, and illumination. And so we commit ourselves to you. We thank you for this lecture. And we pray, Almighty God, that as we explore the topic of human trafficking, modern day slavery, that you will enable us as leaders of your church, not just as Baptists, but the church at large, that we will be committed to ensure that our people are liberated from all oppressions, including human suffering. We thank you for this evening, and we thank you for those who are gathered here, and we pray that by your Spirit, you grant unto us wisdom and insight through Christ our Lord, our Savior. Amen.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, let me extend a warm welcome to you all. It is really great to be here again for another staging of the George Liele Lecture. This is the 22nd staging, and we are truly thankful to God that we are here another time. And again, this year we are in Kingston and St. Andrew. We're going to be hearing a statement made from our chairman of the Jamaica Baptist and Historical Society, Mr. Jeremy Taylor. But it is my pleasure this evening to welcome those of you who are here in the chapel and those who are joining us online. The Jamaica Baptist and Historical Society being mindful of our mandate to aid our Baptist constituents and the nation in general in sharpening our collective memories. We believe that it is important for us to interrogate the present, to be informed and armed with knowledge and lessons from history, so that we do not repeat past mistakes. Neither do we revel in the things that we have achieved, but instead we take inspiration and enabled by the Holy Spirit, be inspired to do better, to become better, and to help others along that journey as well. So it is my pleasure to welcome members of the Historical Society who are here with us this evening, and those who are online who work behind the scenes to ensure that we have everything in working order. Allow me also to extend a welcome to our President of the State Baptist Union, who is here with us, Reverend Black Fraser, who's here. Thank you so very much for joining us, and other members of the ministerial ranks of the Jamaica Baptist Union. We also have friends of the Baptist Historical Society who are here and members in their own right. Mr. Peter Esquivel, welcome. You might be wondering, what Professor Peter Esquivel, and you're wondering, yes, he is Roman Catholic, but he is a member of our Historical Society. And you'll be hearing more in the days to come as we extend the welcome to others as well and share with you how you can become a member of the Historical Society. So at this time, I'm going to be inviting Mr. Jeremy Taylor to give us the statement.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Mr. President. I begin by quoting Trevor Bernard's article on slaves and slavery in Kingston, 1770 to 1815. Please note that time period kind of also spans George Lie's lifespan, the time he was here on earth. Trevor Bernard opens the article in this way, quote, "If you wander down to the waterfront of Kingston's magnificent harbor, you will see no reminder of the most important fact about Kingston's history. That it was where nearly 900,000 Africans were landed to begin what was usually a miserable existence as mostly plantation slaves and occasionally urban slaves. Between Kingston's founding in 1692 and the abolition of the slave trade in 1908, only Rio de Janeiro in Brazil as a slave port for a much longer period than Kingston surpasses Kingston as the American location where most Africans became slaves in this part of the world. Yet there is no marker among the docks, the banks, and commercial buildings that comprise the Kingston waterfront, where in the 18th century, peaking in the decades after the end of the American Revolution, thousands of Africans arrived every year to be sold into slavery, sometimes immediately after disembarkation." End of quote. We are also fortunate that we have a historical record as to the preferences of Jamaican and also Caribbean plantation owners. In 1701, the Royal African Company informed its agents and factors at Cape Coast Castle, now in modern-day Ghana, that, quote, "We are advised from the islands that boys and girls under 12 years old sell very well. Rather than buy any Negroes above the age of 30, supply them with healthy boys." Quote. We are indeed honored and grateful that Mrs. Diahann Godon-Harrison, the children's advocate, is here to address on what is, can it be said, a repetition or a new iteration of an odious and detested aspect of our history, that is the age of enslavement. In a short while, she will be sharing her thoughts on the topic, Human Trafficking, the New Slavery. The Jamaica Baptist Historical Society was established in 2003 following the JBU Mission Conference held in Ocho Rios. The Reverend Clement Gale was our patron for life. We have not replaced him since he has passed. and also the first and second George Liele Lecturer. The aims and objectives of the Society are to research, document, preserve, and promote the history of Baptist work and witness in Jamaica. The Society has staged the Annual George Liele Memorial Lecture during October as part of our contribution to heritage-related activities. The lectures are intended to educate the Baptist community and the wider public on important aspects of our history and heritage, and the contribution made by the Baptist Church in the development of Jamaica. It started as an itinerant lecture going to the people, and today the lecture has been held in St. James, Trelawney, St. Anne, St. Catherine, Clarendon, Manchester, Kingston, St. Andrew, and St. Thomas. But for the changes wrought by COVID-19, we will be going to the other parts of this island. But COVID-19 adaptations have also enabled us to reach a much wider audience, and we thank you again for joining this year, those who are here in chapel and those who are joining online, which is where I suspect the majority of our audience will be. The work of the Society has depended on the goodwill and services and faith of a dedicated band of volunteers who, except for perhaps the Reverend Carly Bolt, Reverend Dick, Reverend Layla, and Reverend Espute, none of us are trained historians. I ask that you figuratively watch this space as we roll out the programs for 2026, including, we hope, an internet presence, which might have a connection to the previous lectures that have been video recorded and broadcast. On behalf of the Jamaica Baptist Historical Society, I thank you. I thank especially the pastor and members of Mamby Park Baptist Church for allowing us to use this historic building. Thank you all for joining us live and virtually and being here.
You may applaud, yes. Put your hands together and applaud our chairman. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, for giving that statement, establishing our purpose of being here and where we are headed this evening. And so at this time, we are going to be preparing to hear from our speaker, but as is customary, wherever we gather, that congregation blesses our hearts with one or two items. And this evening is no exception. We have an item from the Mamby Park Church, and after Mamby Park do their item, we will be receiving the introduction of the speaker, and this will be done by Dr. Elaine Allen, a member of the Historical Society. So we are going to be getting our item now. Our item is a solo from the Mamby Park Baptist Church.
No man is an island, no man stands alone. Each man's joy is joy to me, each man's grief is my own. We need one another. So I will defend each man as a brother, each man as my friend. I saw the people sing, I heard the music start. The songs that they were singing is ringing in my heart. is an island. No man stands alone. Each man's joy is joy to me. Each man's grief is my own. We need one another. So I will defend each man as my brother, each man as my friend. No man is an island. No man stands alone.
Good evening, everyone. I know you are anxiously awaiting the presentation. So even before I begin the introduction, I'll invite you to have your pencils and if your tablets are there, get them ready because you are going to be fed this afternoon. And the person who's going to feed you is our presenter. And she's doing the 22nd George Liele Lecture. She is a graduate of the Norman Manley Law School with over 20 years experience and has practiced at the public bar since graduation. Prior to her current appointment, she served as a Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions within the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Known for her advocacy skills, she states that her current roles provide a national and regional platform from which to promote the rights of children and other people in vulnerable circumstances from a victim-centered and rights-based orientation. She's also passionate about accountability frameworks through which persons who violate the rights of children and vulnerable persons can be held responsible for their actions. Our presenter is an associate tutor at the Norman Manley Law School and has been an external reviewer for the British Council in Jamaica and has been designated champion for CARICOM's regional sex guidelines for courts. In November 2019, she was certified as a global expert by the Geneva-based Justice Rapid Response Roster for global experts in international criminal law for potential deployment worldwide, with a focus on crimes against humanity, war crimes, and international human rights law. Since 2020, our presenter has been a serving member of the Board of Directors for the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, a United States-based nonprofit organization that works in over 200 countries worldwide. Help me welcome our presenter, attorney at law, children's advocate since 2012, Jamaica's National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons since 2015, the initial holder of each such post in the Latin American and Caribbean region, Mrs. Diahann Godon-Harrison.
Well, I want to thank you for such a very warm welcome. It is good to be here, and it is good to see all of you who are in the chapel, as well as those persons whom have joined online. Now, I'm sure that because the president of the Jamaica Baptist Historical Association is no stranger to Baptists, you know where he works. And I'm sure if you were listening, you would have heard that I too had the great privilege to have served in the office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. So without taking and telling tales out of school or out of office, I must say that when my dear friend and colleague Jeremy reached out to me, I had no choice. And so without getting any details, I said, look, I don't know where I'll be on the 12th, but once I am in the island, I will be here. So I can't tell Jeremy no, couldn't then, and I still can't now. So I want to thank you, Jeremy, for having contacted me on behalf of the society. And I want to thank you for welcoming me into this particular church. Now, the last time I was here, it wasn't such a pleasant occasion. My godfather, in fact, of blessed memory, Fred McClymont, was a member here. And so my last time here was for Uncle Fred's funeral. But nonetheless, it is good to be here and to continue building memories within this particular church and members of the immediate congregation, as well as Baptists on a broader scale. Now, I am going to be focusing this afternoon on the topic of the day. And the topic that Sir Jeremy gave me was human trafficking in Jamaica, the new slavery. And so you will forgive me if I take off the other hats that I wear and keep on that hat of being Jamaica's National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, so that I can dedicate my comments and focus on what it is we're here gathered for this afternoon. Now, before I get into the presentation, yes, I see it's queued, I must say that it is a distinct privilege and honor to be invited and to be sharing with you on this, the 22nd occasion of the George Liele Lecture. Now, George Liele, as we all know, or most of us may know, was in fact born into slavery and walked a particular journey, though not in Jamaica initially as a slave, but certainly in North America until he was eventually emancipated. And so I feel that this topic that I've been asked to speak on is particularly relevant to his life and perhaps certain emotions and experiences that he would have had, and to give us that particular perspective as we look back into history and compare it with where we are now. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into, figuratively, the presentation for this afternoon's lecture. So as I said, it's human trafficking in Jamaica, the new slavery. Next slide, please. So I'll start with a brief overview, which just tells you how I intend to speak to you about different subcategories in this particular theme. And it is projected for your reading. So we can move then to the next slide. I'll start with my introductory comments by way of setting the context and the background. So human trafficking is also known as modern-day slavery or trafficking in persons. For our purposes, within the Jamaican context and within the human trafficking lingua, if you will, these terms are seen as being synonymous. So sometimes people say human trafficking, Other persons may prefer trafficking in persons, and other persons may say modern day slavery. We're talking about the same subject matter. Human trafficking is synonymous as well with huge profits for the traffickers, and it is the largest growing form of organized crime in the world, second only to drug trafficking. The last estimate that was done some years ago saw profits for the traffickers from their illegal activities amounting to approximately 150 billion US dollars. That's an enormous amount of money. And so human trafficking is a crime because we have laws that prevent it, so it's a criminal activity. But as you will come to see as we go through this presentation, it is also a gross and egregious human rights violation. And that's because human trafficking strips the individual who becomes a victim of his or her individuality, sense of dignity, sense of worth, and own direction in terms of how they wish to live their lives. So it is a human rights violation that has been criminalized across the world, so it's also a crime. Next slide, please. Perhaps the starting framework that has kind of pulled different countries across the world to talk about this issue of human trafficking globally is what is commonly known as the Palermo Protocol. The proper name for this protocol, however, is the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. And that was a United Nations protocol that was adopted in 2000 in Palermo, which is why it's called the Palermo Protocol. And it defines human trafficking and establishes international standards for preventing it, protecting victims, and promoting state cooperation. So that's the global outlook from the UN. Jamaica, being the jurisdiction that we are, we take our cues well from the international community. And because we were a state party to the Palermo Protocol in 2000, it meant that there were certain obligations now that Jamaica was going to be bound by if we were going to be true to what the protocol expected us to do. And so in 2007, Jamaica enacted its own local legislation that really sought to give roots to the principles of the Palermo Protocol here in Jamaica. That piece of law, that legislation, is called the Trafficking in Persons Prevention, Suppression, and Punishment Act. And as the name says, it has various provisions that speak about what we need to be doing to prevent human trafficking from taking place within our shores. It also talks about the different ways that we can suppress identified acts of human trafficking. And of course, where persons are held liable and guilty before the courts and they're convicted, there is a regime within this legislation that speaks about the kinds of sentencing options that are available to the court to hold them accountable. So that's the punishment side of it. Next slide, please. So what then is the Office of the National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, and how does this fit into the Jamaican context? So the Office of the National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, which I lead as the National Rapporteur, also known as the ONR-TIP, was established by the government of Jamaica, that's the executive arm, the cabinet, to create an independent and objective reporting system on the issue of human trafficking in the country. And we know, most of us may have heard, that there is a report that's issued every year. Sorry, I'm picking up. You're not able to see the slides very well, are you? No. Let's change the color of the font, please. Can we do that? Just make everything black or navy blue. I apologize. Just a moment while we take a break in transmission. Yes, thank you. Which one is that? Okay, all right, thank you. Okay. Still working. You seen the what? Do you want me to continue? Yes? All right, thank you. I'm getting the cue that I should continue, so perhaps the team at the back would pick up from the slide about the ONRT. Okay, I'm hoping that's a little more visible, yes? All right, okay. So I was saying that there is a system, a global system, that rests within the State Department of the United States to do a global assessment and ranking of how different countries across the world are doing, who are state party to this international UN document, and to rank us, whether we're tier 1, tier 2 watch list, or tier 3. And so we get these reports every year, which basically tells Jamaica how Jamaica is doing and where we're ranked. But the government of Jamaica decided that, look, we need to have our own internal barometer, our own internal assessor, who will tell us how we're doing, so we know what we need to correct in terms of what gaps we have to plug, what are we doing well so we can scale up those interventions, and what are the trends and the things on the horizon that we need to be aware of so that we're ahead of the game. And so it was that kind of rationale and thinking that led to the establishment in 2015 of the Office of the, well, first appointing me as National Rapporteur, and then I created the Office of the National Rapporteur to get a team to assist me with this particular task. Now, for the operations of the ONRT, the 5 Ps are important. The Palermo Protocol speaks about 3 Ps. Prevention, which we spoke about, because we don't want anybody to be a victim of human trafficking. We speak about the protection of victims who have been so identified, and it also speaks about the need to prosecute perpetrators and to hold them accountable for committing the crime of human trafficking. We have added 2 more P's based on our perspective and assessment of what we need to be doing to effectively cauterize human trafficking. And those 2 are partnership and policy. Partnership has been added because we recognize that since human trafficking is organized crime and operates like any business would, it's a syndicate, it's organized players who have their goal, what kind of strategies they're going to use to lure their victims, and what it is they're going to be seeking to achieve in terms of their own profits. We recognize that we cannot do it alone. And so the need for collaboration and an integrated response is key, so that's why we added partnership. And of course, the policy framework has to be right if we're going to be effective in the fight against traffickers. So those are the 5 P's that guide the work of the Office of the National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. Next slide, please. So then, let's look at the definition of human trafficking. And this is now based on the Palermo Protocol and Jamaica's own law through the local legislation that I told you we enacted in 2007. So human trafficking is a crime, so it's a criminal offense, and it involves the exploitation of persons. The legal definition consists of 3 core components. These are the act, the means, and the purpose. The act is it that you are recruiting someone for the purpose of exploiting them? Or is it that you're merely transporting someone knowing full well that you're transporting them to a place where they will be exploited? Is it that you're transferring them from one place to the other? So you're taking them from St. Mary to Kingston, or you are assisting the movement of those persons? Or is it that you're harboring an individual for the purpose of facilitating that individual's exploitation? So that's the act. Then we also have the means. How did you recruit them or cause them to be transported or transferred or harbored? Was it through threatening them? Was it through abducting them? Was it through acts of deception? Was it actual abuse of power or their position of vulnerability? And what that looks like, for example, you blackmail someone and you tell them, unless you do this, I am going to expose what happened in your past, or something that is happening with your family that you're ashamed about. Or it could be the classic one that involves the grooming element. So you meet someone, they're nice to you, they're telling you all of these wonderful things, showering you with attention, buying gifts and so on, and luring you into a relationship to make you feel attached to them, but they know that the end game is merely to woo you in and then introduce you into a life of trafficking. So that's the deception. And then, of course, abuse of power and position of vulnerability, I think, are pretty straightforward. And then, of course, the purpose always has to be for exploitation. So those 3 elements must exist at the same time for the crime to be seen as human trafficking. All right? So that's the act, the means, and the purpose. Next slide, please. What then is child trafficking? Child trafficking, simply put, is the exploitation of a person who is under 18 years, because that's who we define as a child. Now, child trafficking requires less to be established. And so there are 2 things that need to take place for it to be child trafficking. And you have to have the means and the purpose. But the act, you have to have the act and the purpose, but the means is irrelevant. So is it that you have abducted this child to put the child into a life of exploitation? Is it that you have lured the child by having text messages over a period of months and then you introduce the child into trafficking? So that would be the act, and of course the purpose is for exploitation. The means through which you do it is irrelevant, because the law says children are more susceptible to be fooled. They're more susceptible to fall into the wrong set of circumstances. And so there's a greater level of protection that the law gives. So when it comes on to somebody under 18, the law doesn't care how they were ensnared into a life of trafficking. All that the law cares about is that you have this child in your home, or you have transported this child, or you have transferred this child for the purpose of someone to exploit them. So once you have those two, you have child trafficking. Now, before I move on, I want to address a myth that exists when we talk about trafficking, whether child or regular human trafficking. Many persons believe that for trafficking to occur, you have to have movement. You can be trafficked right in your own home without moving. So the term really, human trafficking, is perhaps somewhat of a misnomer because you don't require movement to be trafficked. Human trafficking is simply exploitation. So you don't have to move from Jamaica to the Bahamas or Jamaica to the US and then you say, oh my God, the child was trafficked. The child could be living in his or her own home every day and they're being trafficked. A woman could be in a particular position in a bar where she goes to work every day and she's being trafficked right there when she gets to work. It doesn't require movement. All right, so I want that misnomer to be kind of put aside. And once you hear human trafficking, trafficking in persons, or modern day slavery, you should say, okay, that means the exploitation of another human being. So that's what it is. If we could go to the next slide then. So before we look at the forms of human trafficking, allow me for a minute to just look back at slavery. This is the historical type that, of course, Sir George Liele would have been exposed to in his lifetime. So slavery, as it then was, entailed the practice of one person owning another as property, which was often used to gain free or coerced labor from that person. The enslaved person had little to no personal liberty or rights to control their own life. Individuals became enslaved through capture in war, kidnapping, punishment for debt or crime, or being sold by their relatives. And I went back because I'm going to ask you to think about what historical slavery was, what it represented, and how it was manifested as we go on to consider what are now recognized as the types of human trafficking as they exist today. Next slide, please. So the first type I want to talk about is the one that most people know about, and that is sexual exploitation. Now, the victims of sexual exploitation tend to be mostly women and girls, and their traffickers are often people with whom they are familiar, such as a neighbor, a friend, an acquaintance, or a member of their family. Now, what then is sexual exploitation, and how does that differ from sexual abuse that we hear about all the time? Why isn't every act of sexual abuse sexual exploitation, which would mean human trafficking? If we go back to the definition, we have to have what? Three things existing simultaneously, side by side: the act, the means, and the purpose. So if you have any of those elements missing, it's not sexual exploitation, but it is simply sexual abuse. So not every rape or act of rape or incest is sexual exploitation, because the exploitative part of it comes in because there has to be a benefit to another person. So I'll give you an example. We have all heard of prostitution from the days of the Bible, and it continues to be with us. Now, the typical prostitute who is not a victim of sexual exploitation or human trafficking is one who decides that this is the way I am going to feed my family, and decides to go that particular path to earn money. But then you have others who do not consciously make that decision, but they are controlled by an individual known in the human trafficking world as a John, and that person says to each of the women that he has recruited that you must take in $20,000 each night, and you must be at corner X, and you must also know that I have persons who are watching you, so you dare not be on corner X, and you dare not hand over the money that you're paid to the person who is watching so that it can be handed to me. So you see the difference. So that person is being exploited, money is being passed, but it's not going to the person, right? So they're being exploited for the benefit of another person, which is what human trafficking is. It can also be non-commercial, because sometimes people, especially if there is a gang syndicate or a gang culture, where people exact revenge and impose their dominion and power by saying, look, you will do this because I want to avenge a particular situation that your cousin did. So there's no money that is passed, but there is certainly a humbling of the victim who is made to do the particular act because the other person wants to look like they're large and in charge. So it doesn't have to be money, it can be for some other benefit. So once the benefit is for an individual other than the one who is doing the exploitative, who is doing the actual act, then it becomes human trafficking. We also have what is known as debt bondage as another type of human trafficking. And debt bondage is where work is exchanged for the repayment of a monetary debt, which ultimately can never be repaid. And how that comes up, let us say that you recruit foreign nationals from a particular country and you bring them into Jamaica and you say, look, I know times are hard where you're living, so I will pay the $1 million plane fare to get you to Jamaica. I will give you accommodation, I'll take care of your meals, and I will transport you to and from your place of work. In exchange for all of that, I'm going to pay you, but I'm going to pay you 5,000 Jamaican dollars for the month. And what you will do is you will save from your earnings and pay off the $1 million plane fare, pay off the transportation to and from work every day, pay off the cost of your meals. And when you do that, then you can go your way. Now that can be paid off with $5,000 for the month. And so that person is bound to the person who has brought them over. And so that is a form of exploitation as well, known as debt bondage. Another form of human trafficking is domestic servitude. And this typically occurs in private households where the victim is forced to work for extremely long and unconscionable hours with little or no breaks, little food, and in many instances for little or no pay. So we're seeing a situation where work starts typically at, say, 3 a.m. because you have to fix everybody's lunch for them to go out, you have to do breakfast, you have to clean the place, and then you continue working until, say, midnight. So it's from 3 a.m. all through the day until midnight, and then you will get your little 2.5 hours sleep and back at it again. And you're having bread and probably very low protein sources and hydration throughout the day. So that's domestic servitude. Next slide, please. The other forms of human trafficking is you have organ harvesting, and this occurs where a victim is sometimes coerced or deceived into giving up one of their organs in anticipation of receiving sizable payments which do not always materialize. So there are theories in some countries that when you hear of missing persons and people being mysteriously kidnapped and so on, that it could be to supply organs for a black market, or for persons who don't know that they're getting it from the black market, but they're waiting for that kidney transplant and they need that kidney to save their lives. and they think they're getting a kidney by someone who is a willing donor, not knowing that you have human traffickers who are capitalizing on this vulnerability and taking people's organs, selling them, and they pocket the money and the donor doesn't get anything. So that's organ harvesting. We also have forced marriages. Now, this refers to situations where a person, regardless of his or her age, has been forced to marry without their individual and/or collective consent. So this doesn't only relate to minors, to children. It could be a grown woman who is identified as the person who must marry person X, and that is usually tied up with forms of domestic servitude and also sexual exploitation. And then another form of trafficking that is recognized globally but is not yet in our local legislation is that of forced criminality. And this occurs when adults and children are forced to commit criminal activities for the benefit of somebody else. How many persons have heard this thing that if you have a nice, slim youngster, it's good to push him through the burglar bar because him can go in and you can go in as the thief? So that youngster is compelled to do it or else. So that is a form of forced criminality because you have now used this youngster to commit an act of crime without him being willing to do it. And the benefit that you're getting, not him, is whatever it is you're going to steal from the household. So that's an example of forced criminality. Another one is where you use a child or a person as a lookout. You watch and see when the owners come in and tell me, you are not getting anything as a lookout person, but if you don't do it, they're coming for you. And then, of course, we know the situation in Jamaica with the gangs, where school children are sometimes used to transport the guns in their knapsacks because they're the ones that are going to be least suspected by the police. So those are examples of forced criminality that exist here in Jamaica. And so, of course, one of the things that I've certainly been advocating for through my office is that we add forced criminality as another type of human trafficking that we have here in Jamaica. Next slide, please. So there are some subtypes which I've just put up for your consideration. Familial trafficking is simply human trafficking within the family, where a family member is the one that, causes their relative to be trafficked. Cyber trafficking is human trafficking that involves the use of cyberspace. So that's where you introduce the Facebook and the Instagram and so on as the means through which to identify your victim and lure your victim into the trafficking experience. And then we have sports trafficking, which basically is human trafficking in sports, through sports, and around sports. An example comes to mind. Youngster gets a beautiful scholarship to go overseas because they have great talent on the track. Youngster is injured while overseas and becomes vulnerable because, of course, the scholarship is gone, so it means school is gone, and then you have persons who recognize that there is this vulnerability, and then they prey on that one-time sports star and lure them into a life of trafficking. And we've actually seen cases like that that involve Jamaican students who have gone overseas. Next slide, please. So what then are the signs of human trafficking that we need to be aware of? There are some behavioral indicators, and if you see someone appearing particularly fretful and fearful and anxious or depressed, sometimes that is a sign that something is not right. Also, if the person appears particularly withdrawn from family or friends or persons with whom they were usually comfortable. The physical indicators: poor hygiene, malnourished, or appearing to be very fatigued on a regular basis. Physical and or sexual signs of physical and or sexual abuse. Physical restraint, like you see, like there is a lot of marking, like they would have been bound in probably cord or something. That's also a sign. And confinement and torture. A popular one is that traffickers like to brand their victims. So if you see, for example, a group of young ladies and they all have what may be a similar looking tattoo or a brand, sometimes that is a telltale sign that they are being victimized as victims of human trafficking. There's also, if you find persons who you wonder where they get it from, spending excessive amounts of time online or at all odd hours of night communicating with unknown individuals, that is a sign. There are also the psychological indicators, signs of trauma. They seem very jumpy all the time. They overreact to very simple things. They cry for inexplicable reasons, just spontaneous tears and so on. And also if they tend to have low self-esteem or consistent feelings of worthlessness, that's a part of the stripping of the dignity and the humanity which accompanies trafficking. Then there are the social and environmental indicators. A child is not attending school regularly. The teacher observes that, every other day this child is missing. And when the child does come, it doesn't look like the child is coming from home. What's happening? Where somebody works excessively long hours or working inappropriate jobs for their age. So a 15-year-old who is a barmaid and is there all the time, even, in very difficult circumstances. If the person is traveling with an individual but not being allowed to answer questions for themselves. So you are in the immigration hall and every question that is put to the female companion who is an adult, the male companion is answering for her. That's something that needs to be watched. And also if the person is in possession of unexplained wealth, has all kinds of excessive cash and gifts, those are telltale signs. Next slide, please. So what then is the profile of the victim? And the profile of the victim I'm speaking about are the victims that we have come across right here in Jamaica. Next slide, please. So in Jamaica, females are primarily trafficked for sexual exploitation purposes, while males are more often exploited for labor, right? Next slide, please. We've seen a significant number of the victims identified in Jamaica being children, and they're between the age of 11 through to 17. In the human trafficking lingo, that's referred to as the prime shelf life of a victim. And that means young at the prime of their lives, so you'll have a lot of time to exploit them. Many of these victims are from low-income backgrounds. They are in school, or sometimes they are unemployed at the time of the recruitment. So they're looking for a better life. And this better life desire is exploited. Next slide, please. Now, we have identified 56 victims since we have had our Trafficking in Persons Act. And that's, of course, between the period 2020 to 2025. 80.4% of those victims were children, while 19.6% were adults. So that's persons 18 and over. So we see children are disproportionately represented as victims. Next slide, please. If we look at the statistics, therefore, for that 5-year period, that's 2020 through to 2025, we see in 2020 we had 8 victims identified, 7 of them were children. In 2021, 10 victims, 6 were children. 2022, 11 victims identified, all 11 were children. In 2023, 13 victims were identified, 7 of them were children. And in 2024, of the 10 victims identified, all 10 were children. And so far for 2025, we have identified 4 victims, and all 4 are children. So that's about an 80% representation in the statistics of them being children or child victims. Next slide, please. Victims were trafficked for the purposes of sexual exploitation. In fact, 73.2% of them were trafficked for sexual exploitation. And when you compare that to the number or the percentage trafficked for forced labor, it was 25%. And there was one victim that straddled both. So that victim was exploited sexually and also for labor purposes. So who then is the trafficker? Men, so far in Jamaica, are predominantly identified as the main perpetrators of human trafficking. However, females are gradually assuming a more dominant role. They are appearing as traffickers themselves or as very significant players within the human trafficking syndicate or organization, and they assist with the recruitment and so on. They assist with the orientation as to what the new recruits must do if they're going to have this business operate and bring in the profit. So we see that women are really using their nurturing side for a not so good purpose. Next slide, yes. So Jamaica achieved its first human trafficking conviction in 2008. Since then, a total of the 17 convictions that we have achieved between the period 2008 to 2025. Since then we have had 17 convictions, And we saw that the cases involved 11 adult males and 6 adult females as the traffickers. So let's look then at some actual human trafficking cases that have been prosecuted in the Jamaican courts, of course, without revealing too much specificity. So the first slide speaks about a Jamaican male who was the trafficker. He was convicted in 2018 for having recruited underage victims, all boys, and forced to beg at the stoplights across Kingston. When convicted, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison on 11 counts because there were 11 youngsters. Now, I want to explain this stoplight thing because it's a phenomenon that I know we're all very familiar with. You remember the example I gave about people going about prostituting of their own free will versus having a John who says that you're to be there? In this particular case, the boys had their little cans collecting money. They had their little sheet for their football club. And the story was that they were collecting money so they could buy gear to go overseas to a football camp. And they were doing this under the auspices of their coach, who was attached to their school. Lo and behold, suspicion arose because of something that happened with one of the youngsters and his mother, and the mother made a report to the police. And the investigation led to certain startling findings. For example, the man who had gone to the parents and gotten their permission for the boys to come with him for 2 weeks to this local football camp didn't know that they were begging money at the stoplight. It turns out that the man wasn't actually a football coach, and the school that he said he was attached to, the principal had never heard of this man in his life, and the school that he said had authorized him to take the boys overseas knew nothing of this particular organization. And it turned out that when the boys were busy begging all over Kingston, all of the proceeds were pocketed by this particular man. So he was convicted for human trafficking and sentenced to 2 years. The other slide speaks about a Jamaican male again, who was convicted in 2019. And in this particular case, he lured an underage victim from Haiti, he being a fisherman, and exploited her sexually for years, and also there were acts of domestic servitude. Of course, that was a particularly interesting case because there was a language barrier, but nonetheless, the investigation was done and the prosecution was done, and he was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment at hard labor. The following slide shows another trafficker who was convicted in 2023, a Jamaican male again, and in this case, he recruited and exploited an underage girl and forced her to produce pornographic materials that he was sharing and getting profit for on some kind of website and so on. The outcome of this was a sentence of 6 years and 9 months imprisonment at hard labor. The following slide again features a Jamaican male trafficker who was convicted in 2020, and he tricked an underage victim and exploited her sexually. He was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment, and he was also ordered to pay restitution to the victim for having disrupted her life in the amount of 250,000 Jamaican dollars within a period of 6 months. Of course, I will not express an opinion because I think that sum was woefully short for what her life would have been disrupted by. The following slide now shows a female trafficker, Jamaican, who was convicted in 2024. In that case, she forced the underage victim to work in a bar and then refused to pay her. So of course, you know, in Jamaica, minors are not supposed to be working in bars. They're not supposed to be consuming anything in bars either, let alone working in the bar. Now, how we heard about this case, very interestingly, is that initially the child didn't see anything wrong with working in the bar because she was she had the hope of getting paid. But when she wasn't paid now, things got sour and the situation came to light, and the investigation showed that it was in fact a case of human trafficking, and this female trafficker was convicted and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment last year. The following slide shows another female trafficker convicted in 2018, and in this case, she lured the underage victim and exploited her sexually. And she was given on conviction 4 years and 5 months imprisonment. Then we have a double whammy on the next slide in 2023, where we had a male trafficker, and a female trafficker. So this was an Indian man who was married to a Jamaican woman. So they were husband and wife, and they were in the business of trafficking. What they did is they had instances of forced labor where they recruited persons to work for them. And then of course there was no pay, long hours, no control over their documents, they can't leave and so on. And there was also, so that was forced domestic labor, And so having been convicted, the husband was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, and the couple together were collectively ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $18,337 to the victim. The female escaped prison time, and she was required to pay a fine to the victim, or failing to pay that fine, to serve a 3-year prison sentence. And the fine she was ordered to pay was $1 million. And then we have, I think, the last slide that features traffickers. In 2021, we had a Jamaican male and a female Jamaican, again, husband and wife, and they actually recruited and sexually exploited an underage girl. They were convicted, and the outcome was that the female was fined $2 million, or if she didn't pay it, she was going to serve 6 months in prison and also receive she also received a 3-year prison sentence. So she went to prison. Well, she didn't go, okay, it was suspended for 3 years, and she had to pay $2 million. And then the male was fined $800,000 or 6 months, and also received a 3-year suspended sentence. So who are the victims and traffickers, having looked at these cases that we have uplifted by way of example? Anyone can be a victim. Some persons are more predisposed to victimdom than others because of socioeconomic factors, broken families, so there isn't that home support or the connection to feel like they belong anywhere, or persons who are going through a difficult time. But anyone can be a victim. Who are the traffickers? Anyone can be a trafficker. It doesn't have to be a man, it could be a woman. It doesn't have to be a single woman who is on hard times, but it can be a married woman, as the cases have shown. Who are the victims? Women and girls, as we said before, are typically victims of sexual exploitation, and the men and boys are more exploited through forced labor. We've seen again traffickers are both males and females. We've seen that the victims who have been identified in Jamaica so far are primarily Jamaicans. However, we have had other nationalities who have been identified as victims of trafficking here. We have had Indians, Chinese, Haitians, Colombians, people from the Bahamas, people from Asia, you name it. And we have seen that children are particularly vulnerable based on their age, and it's showing in the statistics. Now, we've seen also in terms of the traffickers, that though the traffickers that we have interacted with in Jamaica are typically Jamaicans, the data shows that we have also identified Indian nationals as traffickers here, and at least one Panamanian. What then is the new trend that we are also seeing based on our purview of human trafficking in Jamaica? We're seeing an increase in familial trafficking, whereby mothers are suspected of exploiting their own children for financial gain. There has been a conviction under the Human Trafficking Act, which involved a male who exploited both his daughter and his stepdaughter for sexual purposes. We have had other instances that have not been prosecuted under the trafficking law, but the behavior qualifies as trafficking. And I refer to an incident that happened 2 or 3 years ago when parents in St. Catherine were renting out their babies who were not yet 1 year old to travel with traffickers to St. Anne for the purpose of being props, to ensure that when people saw them with the baby, they would say, boy, you know, sir, the baby don't eat from morning and I need money to buy diapers and a little formula and so on. And these women were located at the ATM machines in Ocherous and St. Anne's Bay, using the children as props. There were 3 women, separate locations, using the children as props. And as soon as somebody came out of the ATM, that was the story that was sold. And when the matter came to light and they were being questioned at the police station, it turned out that these women did not know the name of the babies. The babies, from their journey from St. Catherine to St. Anne, had had no food, no refreshment out in the sun. And the investigation showed that it is the parents who were happily going about their business in St. Catherine who had rented their children for the day to these persons. And so that was an act of exploitation of a newborn almost. And so that is how we have familial trafficking sometimes taking root. We also see that children are increasingly being targeted, recruited, and groomed by traffickers through online platforms. So this is where the cyber trafficking comes in. And the platforms that are used, for example, are Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, as it then was, Snapchat, and TikTok, and whichever other one will come on stream. We also have WhatsApp playing a particular role as well, because sometimes the conversation is started through that particular platform, and it grows into something where the poor girl thinks she's in love, and eventually after about 3 months of talking is going to meet this suitor, only to realize too late that it's a trafficking situation. So what then can you do? Because I always like to end these discussions on what you can do. It's not about, just talking about the negative and then leaving you feeling helpless and hopeless, but giving you the facts as they are, and then seeing how you in your own space can do something to deal with this issue. So the first big takeaway is, if you believe you know anyone or you suspect anyone who has fallen prey to human trafficking and is a victim, you can do any of the following things. First of all, do not approach the suspected trafficker, because, as I said, this is organized crime that has big bucks involved. And if a criminal is going to be exposed and money is going to be taken from their pockets, they're not going to be happy. So do not approach the trafficker because of the danger involved. What you should do, however, is to report the matter to the nearest police station, so that the special anti-trafficking squad that exists in the constabulary force can be activated to do a special investigation. When the report is being made, you don't have to worry that you don't have every single detail. That's not your job. You're not the investigator. But share what you know, share your suspicion, so that the investigation can take place. What is also very critical is that the person who is a suspected victim, even before the case is established firmly as a human trafficking case, there are rescue and support services that are put in place for that individual that involve, of course, health checks, medical support, and very importantly, psychosocial support, which includes the counseling and that kind of support that a victim may need. Speak to a trusted source as well about anything that you're not clear on, so that you can get the guidance of how to proceed. And the slide here shows the regular numbers that you can call. So you have 119, you'll notice at 811, that's a great tip line for human trafficking, and there's 311, and you can always, of course, contact my office, which is the Office of the National Rapporteur, and at the end, you will see our contact information. We also have resources that we encourage you to be familiar with, because knowledge is power. So that's one of the things that you can do to contribute to the fight against human trafficking in Jamaica. So the Office of the National Rapporteur, we have a number of resources. You will see towards the back, my senior anti-human trafficking officer who is here with me, Colleen. She has a table there with some of our publications that give you useful material so that you can become aware of what is trafficking. If you have forgotten half of what I've said, it's in the material as well. So I encourage you to take the material and also, of course, visit our online resources. So once you go to Jamaica National Rapporteur, .wordpress.com, or just Google JamaicaONRTip.com, it will lead you to all of our resources. On there, for example, we have our Victim Survivors Handbook, which is a handbook that we put together to help victims of trafficking to get their lives back, to take them through the stages of what they need to do to get the help that they are in fact entitled to. We also have an online resource library that you can read at and to your heart's content about human trafficking in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, in North America, in South America, in Asia, in Europe, Australia, you name it. So it's a global resource library that we house just to feed the curiosity of persons, and it is free open access, so there is no payment involved. The other thing that you can do is to become certified as an anti-human trafficking expert. How does that certification work? So we at the Office of the National Rapporteur have developed an online anti-human trafficking awareness course. It takes you just about 35 to 40 minutes, and it gives you information at your own pace and allows you to self-test with little questions that come up at the end of each module before you get to the big test at the end, which is what will lead to the certification. So I encourage you to go to onrtip.gov.jm, click on the Anti-Human Trafficking Awareness course, and in your own time, do the course. Get the information, get your capacity up so you can help us observe questionable circumstances, and you can become familiar with what the Jamaican framework looks like to move us from awareness to action. And of course, at the end of it, retrieve your certificate, which you can boast very much so that you have been certified as an anti-human trafficking citizen who is aware of the red flags. So I encourage you to do that, and you can take the course multiple times. We have persons who make multiple attempts before they finally get to certification, and there's no shame in that because you're doing it at your own pace, in your own space as well, and you are getting the information. And the last slide shows you our contact information, and I'm going to ask you just to make a note of it. If you forget any of it, Google is your friend. Just Google Jamaica ONR tip and all of our contact information comes up, to include our websites, email addresses, telephone numbers, you name it. And we also have a social media presence, and these are our handles on the various platforms that I encourage you to explore as well, so that you can build not only your awareness starting today, but you can continue the journey, because we put out information ever so often to keep persons aware of the new trends and what's happening. And so with that, I close and ask if there are any questions. I am available to respond, but I want to thank you for your attention and for really paying homage to George Liele in this way, given his own beginnings as an enslaved person, as we look at this issue as it affects and impacts Jamaica today. Thank you for your attention, both in person and online. It was my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I know you can do better than that. Come on, let us give our children's advocate, our national rapporteur, a bigger round of applause for that really gripping and in parts touching presentation. We have a number of questions. We have questions that are coming online. However, we're also going to be facilitating questions in the room, and the microphone will be available in a little bit. We have been assured from the outset that Jamaica became proactive in 2007 by establishing our own act, so that we, knowing our internal context, our local context, will be better able to identify and also to prosecute the cases that are brought before us. And there are a number of definitions that have been given to us, which I'm sure that many of us didn't even know that there were all these different types of human trafficking. We thought human trafficking was just human trafficking. But it was very helpful for us to hear the various types, you know, the sexual trafficking, we heard about the debt bondage, and we also heard about the subtypes, the familial, and all the other things, including, I'm sure, fascinatingly, the matter of the relationship to sports. And I am sure that there are a number of other areas that once we begin to dig down, we can find some other things that will be challenging for us. As we heard about and were aided in identifying the victims and the traffickers, I am pretty sure that we can then begin to think even more deeply that perhaps there is none of us here who might think that we are safe, because it might not be. You might say, oh, I am too old for this. Nobody wants this old body. But you might have an old body but a very good working liver, or a very good two working kidneys. So you are also valuable for organ harvesting. So we cannot relax and believe that we are exempt. This is a problem for all age groups, a problem for children, a problem for men and women. But it is particularly telling that our children are so vulnerable, have been vulnerable and continue to be so vulnerable and preyed upon. And it is not shocking anymore to me personally, but maybe for some of you it might be. But those of you who have been watching how society has been emerging would have been seeing the trends of our women becoming more visibly involved in criminal activities and perpetrating these crimes against the children more visibly. We're not saying that it never used to happen. We're saying that we're now seeing more high-profile cases where women are the ones who, as Mrs. Godon-Harrison said, that they are carrying these things out against children in such a way that the women are using their nurturing skills to lure the children into what might seem like safety, but in that space they are being exploited. So we have gotten quite a lot. Now we have heard of the successes, that there were in fact prosecutions and that persons have been convicted. I wonder if any like you are wondering about the fines, that it seems as though that the fines are too lenient and too soft. And so one of the questions that I want to start off with as it relates to the discussion has to do with, there are some definitions that persons need help with, and I'm going to give you 3 that you could write down and respond to. One of them, someone wants to understand a little bit more about the prosecution. why is it the fines seem so lenient comparatively to a sentencing for rape? If someone is raped, what is the sentence? Convicted for rape, what's the sentence? And what is it that would go into consideration to allow for a lesser fine in the case of trafficking, where the case is for sexual trafficking? Another person is asking, what does hard labor mean when someone is given an imprisonment or fined for hard labor? What does that mean? And the third one, which is connected, has to do with the understanding of the definition given earlier, a simplification of what human trafficking is. For our understanding, this is simplified as exploitation. It doesn't mean that you are making the case that it is simplistic, but the simplified definition that human trafficking can be understood as exploitation. How does this impact how the cases are viewed and how the fines are applied? So instead of applying the heavier fines under the Trafficking Act, we go for other fines such as under the Sexual Offences Act. Is it that there is an understanding of exploitation that impacts how sentencing is done? We will start with these, and then I will move to accept anyone else from the floor, and we'll continue with online questions.
Thank you. So I didn't write. I hope I remember. So the fines. So that is up to judicial discretion and the assessment that the judge who is presiding over each case makes of the circumstances that are before him or her. So the judge would usually consider the evidence that has been led, the impact on the victim, and the circumstances, whether it is that the person pleaded guilty at the start or after the first witness was taken. And then the judge, in his or her wisdom, would determine what is an appropriate fine, right? Now, I think most judges will share that sentencing is perhaps one of the hardest and most unclear parts of what it is that they have to do, because not hearing all the evidence, for example, or knowing the circumstances of the case, persons on the outside say, no man, once is this kind of offense, this is the sentence that must be given. But the understanding of the ins and outs and the nuances of the case dictate what the sentence is, and that includes the fines that are imposed. One of the ways I've tried to understand it really is that traditionally in our criminal practice and the jurisprudence in Jamaica, if somebody is convicted for a criminal offense, the traditional usual sentencing options are prison or probably a fine that you pay to the court, so it doesn't go to the victim. Human trafficking is perhaps the first kind of criminal case or criminal offense that has said, in addition to paying the fine of $1 million to the court and going to prison for however long the judge says, you now have to try to restore the dignity to the victim as the perpetrator by paying a certain amount of money. So that's a shift in how cases have traditionally been dealt with within the criminal realm. So maybe, I'm not sure, and I'm not here to speak on behalf of the court, but it may be because it's such a new or relatively new phenomenon under the criminal law that judges are not necessarily, giving the depth of the kind of restitution that would perhaps be seen as more suitable to really put back a victim in the place that he or she would have been in before the trafficking experience would have taken place. I have expressed my view on some of the fines or the sums for restitution, but again, I say perhaps it's because we're still treading into, with just 17 cases, to developing the case law on a broader base. So that's why we're perhaps seeing that. Then there was the question about the exploitation. I want to make it very clear that once we talk about sexual exploitation, the particular offense is not prosecuted under the Sexual Offences Act. Once the word exploitation comes up, it means it's going to be prosecuted under the Trafficking in Persons Act, which is a separate offense. I don't want the two to be kind of confused. And as I said, it goes back to, is sexual exploitation being seen as a softer crime than, say, rape? It is not. And I think that, again, it has to go back to the type of evidence, the nature of the evidence led, and the judge's appreciation for what the circumstances are, and then that is used to determine what sentence is given. Was there another issue? Or have I? Oh, what is hard labor? So I'm sure for persons who are familiar with some of our penal institutions, you might recall hearing of prisoners being put in their short pants and with their cutlass and given agricultural work and so on. So that is how the hard labor would come in. It is something that is determined by our Department of Correctional Services, and that is the government entity that deals with the operation of prisons, and they determine what labor the convicts will get to do while they're serving time. I know that there has been a lot of concern, if you will, in some quarters, because we're not necessarily seeing the hard labor as it used to occur. So perhaps it's now an academic indication of what could happen. But when the court says sentenced to X amount of years at hard labor, it is thereby authorizing the Department of Correctional Services to use whatever hard labor options they have within their regime for the prisoners to do work whilst they're serving time.
Thank you so very much. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes, Mr. President. The microphone to the front.
Thanks much. Firstly, based on research and so on that is being done in the office, is there any sense of the scale at which it is happening in the country beyond those specific cases that have been dealt with? Is there any sense of how more widespread it is than it is? That's one. Number two, is there a screening process for persons that fitted into the court? I may be going off course, but it may be that as a trafficker, I would want to be informed of how the agency educates persons about it so that I can work around. So if there are screening process. Third, in your indication of how we may work with you, what we may do, the responses were primarily individual. Is there any guidance that you would give to us and the church body as a denomination or as local congregations about what we can do to help in the process?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the questions. So I'll deal with the first one first and try to take it in that order. So the cases I mentioned are cases that have been confirmed. There are a number of other suspected instances of human trafficking that are currently under investigation but have not yet been verified, right? But there is very strong indication that instances of human trafficking are increasing, and we're seeing not only persons who are trafficked from Jamaica, but we're seeing persons trafficked into or suspected of being trafficked into the country from overseas jurisdictions, and we have inter-trafficking, meaning you'll take somebody from Negril and then take them to Clarendon for the purposes of exploitation. So it's wider than the statistics of confirmed cases. The second thing was the screening for the court. So I know that we have, not everybody can just walk into court. For the course. So there is an element, but I don't think I would say we do screening routinely. So that is something that we certainly can consider. So I want to thank you for that question because it has now given me more work, but good work, so thank you for that. And then the last question had to do with what the denomination could do as a whole, or perhaps even the church family. So that's something that I think is a useful question, because I believe, and it was a Baptist church, I think, some time ago, where I was asked to present on a particular topic, and the topic they chose at Boulevard Baptist was faith in action. And that was, we're grounded in faith, we know we're supposed to be doing good, we know we help others, but how can we do that? And I'm going to recall on some of the recommendations I made there and hold them out to you in your capacity as president, and also to persons who are otherwise gathered. The church continues to be a critical player in the socialization of our country, even though some persons believe that the church is not as attractive anymore, but the church has a critical role to play in socialization. So for example, instead of dealing with just, the building and so on, have outreach not just for your members, but in particularly troubling communities where you see elements of risk or you hear of actual social problems. So for example, how about a particular club that is not just focused on youth in the church, but youth at the community level? So we can start to engage persons who may be thinking about antisocial behaviors, which may put them on the side of the traffickers, or persons who are in such despair and don't have any real connection with family. There's the absence of guidance. They don't know how to navigate, the path that sometimes is before them. And you bring them in so that awareness sessions can be had within those groups with the youth. There is also the broader community kind of engagement, where you're looking at persons who are perhaps very young parents, or parents who don't have the support, or who don't seem to have the wherewithal to properly guide their children. So how about using some creative means of interacting with those parents so that they don't remain on the periphery and can't help us to really build up the good social norms that we need to be doing, but we are really using the church as an organ of socialization. Another thing that I always talk about is just the encouragement for persons to see themselves as a part of the system. Many times you hear, whenever there's any problem of a national kind of urgency, what are our institutions doing? What is the government or what is the opposition saying about this? Many times not realizing that every single citizen of Jamaica, wherever they sit, have to be a part of the solution, because the government and the opposition and the institutions are not in every community and cannot be in every community 365 days a year. So there are things that your own congregants will see, but opt not to become involved because it is their problem, and I'm here to hold them accountable while shutting our eyes to the part that we can play. We see it, for example, even in jury duty, where persons are always too busy, but yet we all want justice, not recognizing that the dispensation of justice that we have, certainly with regard to criminal matters, many times requires the participation of citizens to even form a jury so we can start the cases. So for me, if those practical discussions could be had in the various women's league, men's fellowship, youth groups, etc., and the outreach programs where we're assisting persons with understanding their civic responsibility as individuals, I think that would be something that would be very welcome. Thanks. You're welcome.
Thank you so very much. While others of you are coming, a question from online. One person is asking, Rosemary's asking, how many children went missing last year? And were the cases, the missing cases, investigated as it relates to trafficking? Because 17 cases resolved since 2008 seems like a drop in the bucket in comparison to the number of children going missing. After you have responded to that, then Reverend Tanisha McFarlane will ask her question. Oh, I'm sorry, Deacon Espiute first, and then Reverend Tanisha.
So I don't have the statistics as to how many children have gone missing since last year. So those statistics lie within the Ananda Alert office, which does not fall within my office. I'm sorry, I don't have those statistics with me. But what I will say is that whenever a child goes missing, there is an investigation into the circumstances. What remains a gap in the statistics as well is that when the child goes missing, the family is very concerned, community members are very concerned, and that information goes public very fast. What doesn't go public very fast is that many of the children return home. And I suppose, you know, human nature, when you can sigh relief and you say, oh my God, the child is back, you're busy hugging the child and welcoming the child and ensuring everything is fine, and you don't necessarily go back to the Ananda Secretariat to say, Johnny came home. So sometimes when they're doing their follow-ups is when they realize, aha, this child is now back home. So the statistics are very public when the child is missing, but not so public when the child comes back home. So that's one thing. The other thing as well is that there is always a concern that if a child has gone missing, in fact, if anybody has gone missing, that missing is not for a positive reason. And so the assessment and an examination as to whether or not that child could be a victim of trafficking is something that the authorities do conduct an assessment of, right? But the danger is to assume that everyone who has gone missing is automatically a victim of trafficking. We don't have any data to support that assumption. I think it's a very tempting assumption, but it can be a very dangerous assumption because the facts do not, in fact, support that conclusion.
Thank you, Mrs. Godon-Harrison, for your very interesting presentation. I have a hypothetical question for you. I'm making this up as I go along.
Yes.
Let us say that there's a foreign country that wants to help Jamaica to build construction facilities. I'm making this up. And they transport workers from that country to Jamaica. I don't want to say traffic, but they transport workers from that country to Jamaica to work. And let us say they might pay the workers maybe below what Jamaica's minimum wage is, or they don't allow those workers to unionize. And let us say those workers, those workers might feel aggrieved that maybe they are not being paid properly, or their housing or their food arrangements. As I say, they might even strike for not being paid. Is that the sort of, I'm making this up as I say.
Yes.
Is that the sort of situation that falls under human trafficking in Jamaica, or is it because they are foreign nationals, they're under some sort of diplomatic immunity and cannot be prosecuted under the Jamaican law? Thank you very much for listening to my question.
Yes. So your hypothetical question is quite interesting, and I use the adjective hypothetical under advisement. But it could be investigated here because it's happening within our jurisdiction. And it could also, if the investigations suggest that there is any criminal offense that has been committed or is being alleged, that could also be properly prosecuted within our courts. Because the recognition is that human trafficking is a global crime. So you could be bringing people in for the purpose of exploiting them. And in that sense, you would be a destination country, a country that is, you know, the destination for trafficking. Or it could be that you are going out, or it could be that you're passing through. So what you described in your hypothetical question would fall into persons who are trafficked into Jamaica, and Jamaica would then be a destination country. So it could be investigated. We have what are labor inspectors within the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. that also have a very critical role to play in the anti-human trafficking framework of Jamaica. And so those labor inspectors are in fact empowered to go anywhere, on any site, any premises where work is being done, to inspect the conditions under which that work is being performed, to look at everything, sanitation, treatment of workers, wages, you name it. And depending on what the labor inspectors see or find, that can trigger an anti-human trafficking investigation. So the hypothetical situation that you have painted, even with mentioning of the strike that hypothetically occurred, is something that could in fact be looked into in our jurisdiction. Thank you, Deacon.
Thank you, Mrs. Godon-Harris, for your presentation.
Yes.
I want to go back to a thought that got triggered when the president asked about the responses from the church. And so I'd like to ask if there have been any global reports of TIP that may be classified as religious in type, and whether or not we should be concerned as a church that we could have trafficking persons based on some kind of religious basis.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very interesting question, and it takes me back to a situation that we certainly had to deal with. I can't be too specific about it though, because the matter has been resolved in some kind of way, but there are still concerns. So these situations, as far as I've seen them in Jamaica, have not related to any of the traditional churches, but we have seen religious leaders who did not necessarily go to any theological school or any seminary and so on, but they have created a church and they have created certain rules that the congregants must subscribe to. And if not, then there are consequences that they are empowered to determine that will flow from the disobedience of the congregants. And I mean, we've heard very outrageous stories of congregants being told, for example, that whatever you make in terms of your earnings, you actually have to give your paycheck or the banking details that you give for payment is the pastor's account. And then he determines what portion you get back. And if not, there are consequences that will flow. If you're taking out an insurance policy, you are told who the beneficiaries should be. We have also heard of certain types of physical inspections that congregants have to subject themselves to for the pastor to determine if they're taking care of themselves. So cavities are examined and so on. And this is seen as a normal part of what the church requires. So there have been concerns about the exploitative nature of some practices, but as I said, there have none have come to my attention so far that really attach to, you know, the more traditional churches that we have in Jamaica.
Thank you so much. I have another question, two other questions from online. One person wants to know if there's a time limit to when a case can be brought, you know, if any statutes of limitations, if the person was underage at the time of trafficking, and their question is saying that they meet the standards, the act means purpose, they are now 18. What can be done in this case?
All right, so until we become a republic, I can say this, that time never runs against the crown. So that means once a criminal act is alleged, the victim can make a report and decide to engage the prosecutorial services at any time. So we have seen cases, and Jeremy, this one, the St. Mary one, where the woman was being sexually molested by her stepfather, And by the time she got the nerve to come forward and give the statement to the police and engage the formal process, her stepfather was like 80 something and he was convicted. So at any time that the victim feels so empowered, so led, the system and the prosecutorial system can be engaged for that person to access justice. So time, there's no statute of limitations in the criminal law.
Right. One other question as it pertains to exploitation. Someone is asking, as it relates to exploitation, it might be fair to say that Jamaica is a context where persons are accustomed to exploitation in sexual affairs, abuse in the home, or as it relates to domestic labor. How do you convince such a context to see the connection to slavery?
Education, sensitization, capacity building, so that at some point we recognize that what we're accustomed to is not the appropriate thing. And I think if I'm to take a very far left example, I'm sure the older persons in the congregation or in the audience, may remember those tarnished, awful little spoons that they used to feed babies with. Anybody remembers them? Those little brass spoons, and you pass them down from one sibling to the next. And then when you eat from them, sometimes they're so tarnished because the brass has kind of worn off and you're tasting the metal. Well, we've come a far way now, whereby the spoons for babies is made out of silicone because it's easier on the gum. And, we have done the research and we have said, okay, this is the way to go now because this is better. So the answer to that is that we can only move against the tide if we have the information to do so. And so it takes time, but bit by bit, the more persons become aware, the more persons are sensitized to what practices are not correct, and the more persons have the capacity to do something, they know where to call, they know who to say, look, I'm not sure what this is, but come and take a look, is how we'll make inroads. So that is why the 17 convictions seem like a drop in the bucket. But more and more, there are more persons who are calling the attention of the authorities to suspected instances so that the checks can be made and a determination can be made if the matter needs to be prosecuted. So culture shift takes time, but we can't just say it's going to take a long time, so we stop. We have to keep doing, because if you save even one potential victim, that's one less. So that's how I would answer that one.
All right, we have two more hands. Ms. Barnett, Dominique, and then Dr. Taylor. Michael, not BK.
Thank you. I wanted to know on the topic of restitution, on the topic of restitution for the victims, do you know if it is a case where the persons either assigned to the victims to represent them or maybe volunteers are unable to recommend a suitable amount for the victims? In the presentation, there was 250 allocated to a victim. In other instances, the traffickers paid 1 million to 2 million. So I wanted to know if it is entirely in the court's hands to assign an amount, or can the victims speak up for themselves and say, I think this is a suitable amount? Mm-hmm. Because I do agree that the 250 seem very
paltry sum, yes. All right, so the victim in a human trafficking case is represented by the prosecution. So you will have a trained attorney who would have prosecuted that matter. And then when you get to the stage of restitution, certain factors are brought to the attention of the court. You may want to, for example, highlight the extent of the harm that the victim has been exposed to, the disruption with their ability to earn or their ability to have gone to school to get their qualification so that they can earn to support themselves. You may want to talk about medical issues or health issues that they've had to deal with, physical ones, and also the need for ongoing psychological care and so on and so forth. So there are a number of factors that can be urged upon the court. In some instances, there can be a suggestion as to the amount, but the final say, because it's a part of the sentencing regime, falls within the purview of the court.
It struck me that when you began, one of the P's was preventative, right?
Yes.
And yet in all the cases that you have made, that you have offered, you catch it way down the line. In other words, it has to go on for a time. Somebody has to notice, by which time the victim has already been in the situation. I'm putting on a different hat now. To what extent are we moving towards earlier detection and using, for example, technology? The government holds a series of data records, school attendance, health records, immigration records, labor statistics, as you suggested. And we have the ability now to use technology to correlate patterns, etc., and find suggested cases earlier. So almost like an early warning system, without having to wait down the line. Of course, it requires joint of government. Are we moving towards this, or are we still dependent on the victim being in a pattern for a long period of time? Somebody has to notice it, and for us to then.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. So that's a yes and no answer. So the way how the preventative side of this thing has been worked so far is to engage a lot of the first responders. So for example, immigration officers, customs officers, people with port authority, Coast Guard, police officers, you name it. Persons who are in a position to observe certain things. And so there is a very heavy emphasis on training, capacity building, and so on, so that they can know what are some of the red flags and how we can screen persons to ensure that if the red flags aren't obvious on site, we can ferret them out. So that has been a very strong kind of push, along with the public education campaigns, the national drive, and then also dealing with human trafficking in schools, so that the target population that usually falls prey based on the statistics are aware of some of the traps that exist that can ensnare them in a life of trafficking. So that has been a very strong preventative push. To say, however, that there is this cross kind of fertilization digitally, whereby there is an interrogation of profiles of persons to say, okay, this may be something that we want to say because of the intersections here of coincidence that we want to look into this proactively. I don't know the police strategy, so I can't say that they are doing it or they are not, but I can say that there is a recognition, certainly through the National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons, of the need for that joined up collaboration and partnership. So the National Task Force has perhaps 26 institutions that are made up of all of these entities that you have spoken about: immigration, customs, health, education, prosecutor's office, attorney general, private sector, NGOs, civil society, and so on, because we want to pull people into a network that give them additional legs to help us boost up the prevention. So I know that there is a framework that facilitates coordination and collaboration very effectively, but I can't say definitively that the anti-trafficking task force, which is the nerve center for human trafficking investigations, uses the formula that you have described with such eloquence. I am not sure. Yes.
Can I? Yes. Thank you so much, Mrs. Harrison, for that wonderful lecture. There's a concept in ethics called utilitarianism.
that speaks to the lesser and greater good. I'm thinking of that in the context of migration, right? Human migration and trafficking. We are faced with Haitians that are coming here to escape tremendous violence in Haiti. So at what point, how do we navigate that intersection between? Right now, 3 Haitians are still missing in Portland. Perhaps they're being trafficked. But that is the lesser evil of going back to Haiti. So we have that to face here in Jamaica. Because I know there's that discussion about are we being fair to our Haitian brothers and sisters that come here, that we just send them back immediately. So I just want to ask, how do we navigate that intersection between trafficking and human migration?
Okay. All right. So you have red flagged one of the problem spots for human trafficking, because people on the move, migrant people, whether going or coming, are sometimes more predisposed to vulnerabilities, unless it is they have a well laid out plan and a job and all of that. So the social incohesion and uncertainty that they'll face once they're here makes them more vulnerable, because they would probably want a job, so they would not ask all the questions that somebody who is in a position to wait may ask, or they may want somewhere to live, and so they may agree to a very questionable living relationship, and then it morphs into something else. So you have highlighted very well, I think, one of the risk factors in human migration. The recommended way for dealing with it is, of course, I'm not going to get into the issues of asylum and, you know, all of those other things that exist when you're dealing with migration properly. But there is an approach that says once you have migrants, especially when it's not planned migration, but you're migrating because you're fleeing something, there should be an assessment of the circumstances that surround those involuntary migrants once they're in the particular jurisdiction, to ensure that they're not being, you know, exposed to a life of criminality to then give us more crime to deal with, or to ensure equally from the humanitarian side of it that they're not predisposed to becoming victims because of any violations that would be perpetrated against them. So there's a human rights response that goes with ensuring that all persons in our shores are as safe as they can be, pending the outcome of their situation, whether it's, you know, applying for asylum or some other kind of immigration regulation that may exist. So that's how, you know, that's the recommended best practice. Let me put it that way.
All right. We are going to be wrapping up in a little while. We have one more from the floor. Just give me a chance to ask 2 more from Ever Gospel on YouTube. He has his questions, and he's asking us to answer these 2 questions as well. So he wants to know, 1, is the ONRTIP giving any attention to incentives paid to parents to lure their children to prominent high schools for sports purposes? Is this crossing the line? That's 1. And he also asks, what are the ways that you collaborate with the JCF? Do they have a related unit and expertise in this area to support your work? After those questions, we'll take the question from the floor as the final question from the room, and then 1 more before you wrap up.
All right, so I'll take the second question first because it's the easier one. So yes, within the Jamaica Constabulary Force, there's a specialized anti-trafficking in persons vice squad that is highly trained, a very elite team that really knows all the nuances about human trafficking, not just the investigation of the cases, but equally important, how the victims should be treated, how they should be supported in terms of psychosocial interventions and other practical needs, and the sensitivity that surrounds these cases. So yes, there is a complementary unit within the JCF that treats with this matter, and that unit and representatives of it are also members of the National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons. So there is an integrative relationship that continues to be collaborative. And there was another question.
The other question has to do with the incentives, with sports related.
Right. Okay. So for the sports trafficking, incentives alone would not make it trafficking. For it to be trafficking, you'd have to have the act, purpose, and means. If the person is, above 18, but if the person is below, then you still need to have for the purpose of exploitation. And then, of course, you'd have to have the act. Was the child threatened, coerced, kidnapped, abducted, misled, and so on, to come to a particular school for the sole purpose of exploiting that child? If you don't have that, then it's not trafficking. So for example, just saying, I have a scholarship for you, I'll pay for you to go to school, first to fifth form, come to my school. That alone is not trafficking. You'd have to prove that there's the element of exploiting that child once the child is going to the school.
Okay. This sentencing is very short. You have 2 years sentencing for the perpetrator.
No, I'm not hearing you.
I'm saying that due to the fact that the sentencing process is 2 years, right? I'm just wondering if you have any statistics to show that you have repeated, these same persons are repeated traffickers in Jamaica. And also, we do have a sex traffickers registry. How effective that is right now? Can normal people like me go and get that information so that you know that in the community where you live, a sex trafficker is there? And and the rehabilitation process, what is it like?
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. So we don't have any repeat convicted persons so far in the statistics. So the 17 convictions relate to 17 different offenders. We don't have any evidence of them being brought before the court for reoffending, not yet, but it's highly possible because you have seen the sentences that so far have been handed out, right? So that's something that we continue to look out for. The second question was the sex offenders registry. So the sex offenders registry is housed within the Department of Correctional Services, right? Which is a particular agency within the Ministry of National Security. The registry in Jamaica is what we call a closed registry, which means that John Public can't just walk in and go to the DCS and say, I want to see who is registered as a convicted person for a sex crime in Jamaica. Based on how it's constructed, however, persons can get access to the registry if they have established a basis for the information. And based on the regulations, what those look like is if, let's say, for example, you want to engage a nanny who is going to look after your child, you may want to check that person's antecedents to determine if they're suitable to come and work with your child. If you run a daycare or a school, or you are running a church youth camp and you have a counselor who is volunteering and you want to check if you make a good case in your application to the registrar, then the registrar has the ability to consider the application and to grant access if the conditions are met. I know that's a very vexed issue because we are aware of public registries, for example, in North America, where once you drive on University Drive, your phone is blowing up to say registered sex convictor, registered sex offender, was convicted 2 years ago, lives on street X, and so that's seen as being very proactive and so on. And I know that there has been a push in some quarters that we should go this way. For me, it's something that's very open to debate. But just by way of history and context, I'll tell you, when Parliament was debating how the sex offender registry should operate within Jamaica, there were certain considerations that were given to the size of our population, for example, compared to the vast number of persons in North America, that it's very easy to find somebody in Jamaica. And then there were some considerations about retributive justice, jungle justice, where if persons know that John Brown lives on X Street, you know by the next morning John Brown is dead. And so the issue about having done the crime, served your time, come out, should you just have your life, taken away because of what you did, So it's a live issue for debate, but I'm just sharing the context within which the decision was taken to go closed. You also asked about rehabilitation and how that works. Again, our penal system falls within the purview of the Department of Correctional Services, and they have a whole regime about having incarceration have a rehabilitative goal, so that at the end of the sentence, the persons who were serving time can come back to society having understood what they did, having gone through a particular process of how to treat with certain decisions so that they don't reoffend. And there are various strategies that they use within the penal system to build out the rehabilitative program. And they have all sorts. I mean, sometimes if a person who is a prisoner has a skill, for example, they're allowed to do art. And so they buy, canvas and oil and all kinds of things for them to do that, and then help them to, channel into something that is productive that they can rely on when they go into society. The women are exposed to cosmetology, hairdressing, and so on, but they have their own internal regime that they use to build rehabilitation in terms of skills alongside the psychological aspect of it.
All right. And so I'm going to allow Mrs. Godon-Harrison to sip a little water as she comes back to wrap up for us on a question that is going to give us some direction, some indication as to her office going forward and how we as a people can help to empower that office or be in partnership with the work on the ground. So I was pointed to the U.S. Department, that has reports on human trafficking. For what it's worth, seeing that they're on a lockdown and the site might not be updated, there is a 2024 trafficking in persons report for Jamaica. And the statement is said that the government of Jamaica does not fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking, but is making significant efforts to do so. It then goes on to state 3 items that I believe are critical for our consideration and the office going forward. The government decreased funding to the National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons. It did not approve a draft national policy to combat trafficking, drafted during the previous reporting period. And the government failed to endorse a prevalence research study completed during the reporting period, undermining efforts to build knowledge and awareness of the nature and scope of trafficking in Jamaica. What is the relationship between this report and your office and the report that comes from your office, which also shows disparities in terms of statistics, number of persons identified, prosecuted, and so on, and your response to this segment as you tell us the way forward?
Thank you. So the State Department is the relevant department within the United States government that does this international report, where it ranks different countries. Now, the ranking system, Tier 1 is the highest, and that says that you meet all of the requirements, you're doing amazing, and so on. Then you have Tier 2, which goes with the explanation that the moderator just gave. And then you have what is called Tier 2 watch list, which says that you're about to drop off of Tier 2 and tumble down into tier 3, which is the lowest of the tiers, and that has a lot of geopolitical and economic implications. So if you end up on tier 3, it means that you could lose funding from all US government sources and so on, and it could have implications for the IMF and all of these other institutions that some economies need to stay afloat. Having said that, I'm not going to decry the tier ranking that Jamaica has been given, but what I will say is that there is very heavy discussion in terms of a comparison between Jamaica and other countries that have been given, for example, a tier 1 ranking, which has observers thinking that Jamaica has made greater advancements than some of these other countries. So that is something that I let hang. But what I will also say is that the Ministry of Finance determines how the budget and the estimates of expenditure are awarded to different ministries, departments, and agencies, programs, strategic priorities, and so on. I'm not going to even presume to speak about what that funding allocation looks like. And I see Mr. Townsend in the audience. Not going to put him on the spot at all, but I'm very familiar with Mr. Townsend, and he's very familiar with a particular aspect of government. But there are different things that determine perhaps why that was done. But I think the observations that have been made, as we always do, certainly within my office and other anti-trafficking stakeholders, is we take very seriously the narrative and the shortcomings that have been identified so that we can then see for this reporting period what corrective steps can be taken to ensure that point by point, the observations that have been made are addressed fairly and comprehensively. And so charting the way forward, that's one of the things that we are committed to doing, to having the discussions with all the relevant partners, seeing how we can not only correct what has been pointed out as a deficiency, but surpass it, because there's so many other strategies that we continue to push to ensure that we have a robust anti-trafficking framework. So that's how I think I respond.
Once again, I invite you to put your hands together for our National Rapporteur. Our sessions have always proven to be so educative. We have learned so much this evening, and I'm pretty sure that we are challenged. I just want to assure Mrs. Godon-Harrison that I was reminded that several years ago, the Jamaica Baptist Union did pass a resolution to address human trafficking. And so we are being encouraged to return to that resolution and to see how we can plug that into some of the responses we have gotten today to move the partnership forward, to raise awareness, and also to take concrete actions on this matter in our country. I'm now going to be inviting Mr. Dwight Stewart, a member of the Historical Society, to bring the vote of thanks, and then the Reverend Dr. Glenroy Liele, a member of the Kingston and St. Andrew ministers, colleagues, Baptist ministers, will come and dismiss us with the closing prayer. Thanks again for facilitating us, Mamby Park, and it was a pleasure sharing with you again.
My brothers and sisters, friends, I want to say thanks to the Jamaica Baptist Historical Society for giving me this honor to move the vote of thanks. On behalf of the Jamaica Baptist Historical Society, the George Liele Lecture Committee, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude for your attendance and support at this 22nd Annual George Liele Lecture. The turnout this evening, both in person and online, is truly a testament to the importance of the discussing the topic of human trafficking, which remains a pressing issue in our society. We would also like to express our profound appreciation to our guest speaker or lecturer this evening, Mrs. Diahann Godon-Harrison, for delivering such a compelling and thought-provoking lecture. I want to say, though, that one of the observations in the presentation by our lecturer this afternoon is her insight and the experiences that she has shed light on this harsh topic of human trafficking. And also I observe, and I know you have, the way and the style she answered the questions with clarity. And we want to thank you, Madam Lecturer, for this opportunity. We want to thank you for the work that your office does in fighting human trafficking in our society. We thank you for your dedication in that. We want to say thanks to the Mamby Park Baptist Church for hosting this 22nd lecture. We want to say thanks to the host pastor, the Reverend Sidney Hall, and for our brother who provided that item earlier. We want to say thanks to you and to the church for this opportunity. We want to say thanks to our chairman, Mr. Jeremy Taylor, for his leadership and for sharing the statement of purpose. Dr. Allen, a member of the society, for a gracious introduction of our guest speaker. And lastly, I want to say thanks to our moderator, the Reverend Marvia Laws, member of the society, for our exceptional moderation skills and wisdom throughout the evening, and also for helping to guide the question and answer session. We want to say thanks to you all. And to all who played a role in this evening's success, we say thanks to you. It is our sincere hope that this evening has inspired you to become more involved in the fight against human trafficking and its devastating effects. Thank you all again, and God bless you. See you next year.
If you are willing and able, please stand for prayer. Let us pray. Gracious God, we are grateful to you for the opportunity given to us by you to gather here this evening for this George Liele Lecture. In many ways, we have had a difficult conversation, a very disturbing one in many ways, but one that raised our awareness and is now calling us to action. Remind us that we are required to show love one for the other, that neighbor love is a requirement of our relationship with you and a display of our faith in you. Remind us that as persons who have been descendants of those who were enslaved, drawing from your word in the Old Testament, we have a responsibility always to others who are facing similar circumstances, remembering that we were once slaves in Egypt, as you said to the people of old. Help us, gracious God, to participate in this project, this act of liberating your people, as we engage in actions that will help to prevent, to protect, and where there is need to prosecute, and that will help to develop policies that will make this land in which we live safe for all, and where equality and equity are hallmarks of this land. Teach us, we pray, to engage in whatever partnerships are required to fulfill your will. Hear our prayers for Mrs. Godon-Harrison and those organizations that she leads,
Grant them strength, all the resources necessary, and the assurance of your presence with them always, empowering them to do their work. And help us always to continue to work with you and for you, so that your kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven. As we go to our several homes, those who are traveling, we pray for journeying mercies and safe arrival. And may the blessings of God Almighty, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with us all, now and forevermore. Amen.
Thank you so very much. Safe travel home, and I hope you get a good night's rest. I hope it will be cool. Maybe not as cool as Sligoville, but it will be cool nonetheless. Thank you again. Good night.
Good night. Please feel free to get some refreshment at the back as you go.